Okay, great. Hello, everybody. My name is Stacy. I'm a PhD student at UCLA, and today I'm very excited to be here to talk about how belief-driven and action-driven signaling or strategies can help us solve ambiguity in signaling. So, ambiguous communication occurs all the time in our everyday experiences. Here, when I say the glass, the listener immediately notices that his glass is in a precarious spot on the table and maybe goes to move it. So communication depends not just on our words, but also our actions and abilities in the visual environment that we share. And it depends a lot on the context of our situation, right? So in another scenario, I could have been asking for a refill or maybe noticing that there's a crack in the window pane behind us. And what I'm investigating here is how humans can convey such rich ideas using very sparse and often overloaded communication. And I think it's pretty clear that the reason we're able to do this is because of context. And in this study, I want to focus on two particular types of context. So the first comes from what you can say, and this has been studied really extensively in referential communication games. And it follows this idea that communication is a cooperative way to change others' beliefs. And I think since this is the pragmatic session, everybody's going to be very familiar with this, but I'll just briefly discuss, So in this game, a signaler can send a signal, for example, purple, and the listener tries to figure out what item the signaler is referring to. There are no actions in the instrumental world. You're just describing features. And so agents are still reasoning using those features, but they're reasoning in the context of other available signals that could have been sent. So while purple may literally refer to two different items here, the pragmatic interpretation of it is to think it's the purple circle. Otherwise, you should have said square, as it was more direct. So in this case, we're treating the purple square as the non-pragmatic item. The second type of context we actually want to focus on here is based on our actions. And this is actually completely outside of language itself, based on what we can do. So in this study, you can see on the left, an experimenter is holding a flashlight in one of her hands, and she makes an ambiguous request for help to get a battery. There are two batteries, one's on the far table and one's on the near table. And even toddlers are able to interpret the same ambiguous spoken request for help differentially, depending on whether the experimenter's other hand is free or occupied. So we can attribute this difference to some form of cooperative logic or joint utility reasoning about the situation. So from an individual perspective, these two batteries that the toddler could get to may be equivalent. However, from a joint perspective, they're not. And so when making this decision to go get the far battery, the toddler may reason, if it had been easier for the signaler to do herself, she wouldn't have even had to ask for help. And while these two effects have been studied independently, they've rarely been seen in conjunction in the same context. So we design a paradigm that combines these two to ask, can people use belief and action-based strategies to solve ambiguous signaling? And not only that, we want to know what happens when they give you conflicting answers. Do participants have some kind of preference? So one intuition into this is that linguistic pragmatics involves some kind of recursive mind reasoning, right? And this can actually become a little bit more expensive. And in contrast, action is based on planning and understanding of costs of the environment, which is grounded in vision. And there's evidence that supports that even pre-linguistic infants are able to do this. So this might suggest that reasoning over actions could be less of a cognitive burden than reasoning about pragmatics. And in other words, we want to know, do actions speak louder than words? So the paradigm we've designed looks quite a bit like the referential signaling games. We have the participant play the role of a listener, and they have a partner who will signal. The partner knows the target item's identity, but the participant does not. And the partner can send a signal of a single feature of the intended referent. However, unlike traditional signaling games, we do this in an interactive spatial environment, so a 2D grid world. So now the goal is not just to cooperatively identify the item, but actually to have one of the agents efficiently reach that item. So what happens during gameplay is the signaler who knows the goal can either actually go to that item themselves, or they can decide to send a signal. and that signal will be a single feature. So let's say the signaler says purple. Oh, sorry, one more thing I want to add is that the signaler here is pre-programmed. There is no real person playing with them, but participants are not told that. They're simply told that the signaler is being cooperative. Okay, so the signaler says purple, and now the participant needs to figure out which item do I think that they're referring to. So what they can do is they can hover their mouse over the different items, and what they'll see is they'll see the relative number of steps it takes each agent to get to that item. And then they can make their decision, and they'll go to a particular item. And they don't actually get feedback about whether their choice was correct, only the cost it incurred to get there. And after they do that trial, they're also asked to make a confidence rating on a scale of 1 to 5. How sure were you about your decision? So in our first experiment, what we want to do is look at these two contexts, right? Belief-driven reasoning and action-driven reasoning, as well as what's happening when they come into conflict. And so this is a within subject design, and each subject sees each condition and 20 trials per condition, as well as an additional baseline that I'll introduce here. So in our baseline, we established that the signaler actually doesn't have to talk. So in this case, the signaler will simply walk to an item themselves, and that item will always be jointly efficient for the signaler to reach. So it's establishing that they're playing cooperatively. The next condition we have is this belief-driven pragmatic reasoning condition, and it's purely based on linguistic pragmatics, similar to the signaling game. And the case here is that utility can't help you solve this task. So all items are going to be closer to the participant than to the signaler. And not only that, but any item consistent with the signal is going to be equidistant from the participant. So in this case, if the signaler says purple, you should again reason very similar to the original language game, that the purple circle is the pragmatic option, whereas the purple square is the non-pragmatic option. In the next condition, which is the action-driven utility reasoning, the features of the items actually can't help you solve the task, right? So there are two purple triangles, and the only information you have to distinguish them is their utilities. So you can either look at this from an individual utility perspective or a joint utility perspective, and they will give you different answers. So if I'm an individual utility reasoner, I can tell by hovering over the items that the purple triangle at 4,2 is closer to me than the purple triangle at 0,5. However, if I'm thinking about this problem from a joint perspective, I might reason, well, hey, like that purple triangle at 4,2 is actually a lot closer to the signaler, so they should have gotten it themselves. And in that case, you might choose 0,5. And the last condition we want to look at is what happens when these two come into conflict. So the features of the items here look very similar to the original signaling game. And based on pragmatics, if you hear purple, you might choose the purple triangle. However, at that same time, that purple triangle is jointly inefficient, right? So if you're reasoning using this joint utility dynamics, you should tend to prefer the purple square instead. Given that, we can take a look at our results. So for each of the conditions, what we're interested in is what did the participants actually choose? How did they behave in this case? And we see the proportion of times they choose the pragmatic item versus the non-pragmatic item in this belief-driven condition. And so, of course, we can do this not just for one particular participant, but we can do it across all participants. And what we're seeing here is that about 40% of people are using this belief-driven pragmatics significantly above chance, right? So if they were literal reasoners, we would expect that they have no preference between the pragmatic and the non-pragmatic item. But these individuals are choosing that pragmatic item often enough so that we can't attribute it to chance. And this confirms, I guess, a lot of the empirical results, finding that people are using pragmatics, but it does so in a new sort of visually grounded paradigm. And in addition to individual participant strategies, we also looked at decision time and confidence. So how long did it take people to make their decision? Well, we find that people who make pragmatic decisions actually make them slower than people who make non-pragmatic decisions. And not only that, when they have to self-rate their confidence after they make that decision, they're more confident about their pragmatic decisions than when they make non-pragmatic decisions. And this also sort of fits with a lot of the empirical evidence and like RSA-based models of this phenomena, where pragmatics is a more complicated reasoning process that sits on top of like literal, more simple ones. So the next condition we can look at is the action utility condition, and we do the same thing, right? We're looking at the proportion of times individuals choose each strategy, and we do this across all individuals. And what we see here is that people are very highly internally consistent about what they're choosing. So almost 90% of people choose one strategy and they really stick to that strategy. And we were a little bit surprised that we weren't seeing higher joint utility preference in this case, but we think that there may be not enough motivation or that the effort for engaging in that is too high because of this task. And so we would want to run some follow-ups with some live interaction role reversal to help test this hypothesis. In addition, when we looked at decision time and confidence, what we saw is people took about the same time to make these two decisions, but we did see that people were more confident about their joint utility decisions. So the last condition, which we're really interested in, right, is this conflict condition, where now we're pitting essentially pragmatics against joint utility, and they're giving you different answers. And what do we see across people? Well, we see that, like in the utility condition, people are pretty highly internally consistent about the strategy that they're choosing. About 3/4 of people choose a strategy and stick to it. There seems to be some slight preference for joint utility. More people are using the joint utility strategy, but we don't have enough evidence at this point on the population level to suggest an overall preference. However, when we look at the decision time and the confidence of these people, we see that they're both faster when using joint utility as well as more confident about those decisions. So there does seem to be some kind of slight preference in this case, or maybe it's slightly easier to do. In addition to looking at conditions on their own, we can actually look at how individuals, the same individuals, respond across different conditions. So what we see here is the conflict condition against the utility condition, and that same individual is highlighted, and we look at the proportion of times they make each type of decision. And from this comparison of conditions, you can see that people using joint utility in the action utility condition are also very, very likely to be using joint utility when they come into conflict. So they're highly correlated. However, this is not true when we look at the comparison to belief-driven pragmatics, right? Whether you use pragmatics or not isn't helping predict what you're doing in this conflict condition. So this may suggest that across participants, joint utility is a little bit more of a robust strategy for solving this task. So we wanted to look at this, right? And previously what we found is we found evidence for both belief pragmatics and joint utility in this task, and some suggestion that maybe joint utility is a little bit more robust or a little bit easier. And in experiment 2, what we want to do is we want to focus on this contrast between these two particular strategies and replicate and extend some of the findings that we found in experiment 1. So what did we do? Well, we ran essentially exactly the same task with new people, except we removed 2 of the conditions. So now we're only looking at the conflict condition as well as the signal or walk baseline. And one of the rationales for this was that, well, by seeing those other 2 conditions, maybe you were keying into some strategy that you might not have preferred or thought of otherwise. And what do we see in this case? Well, as before, what we're seeing is that people are relatively highly internally consistent about their strategies. And as before, also, there are more people who prefer joint utility than pragmatic reasoning. However, in this case, this difference is significant across the population. So overall, we can say that there is a preference for joint utility here. And as before, in addition, when we look at decision time as well as confidence, we're replicating the behavioral patterns from experiment 1, right? So people are both faster to make joint utility decisions and they're more confident about them. So in conclusion, we've sort of found that both belief and action-driven strategies are used to resolve signaling ambiguity. And we've done this in this new paradigm. And when forced to choose, people are pretty highly internally consistent about their choices, but they're faster, more confident, and in our follow-up, they prefer joint utility over belief pragmatics. So I think this opens a space for a lot of really interesting future directions. And I'm not going to talk about all of them here, but I'm happy to discuss more offline, and we're currently collecting data on some of them. But I just want to highlight the last one here. Like, in this particular experiment, we're looking at these two sort of strategies in conflict. You have to make some sort of decision between one or the other. But in reality, they're not actually mutually exclusive, right? Like, you could be using both at the same time to help you resolve signaling ambiguity. And so one of the next experiments that we'd really like to run is, can people do that? And how easy is it for people to do that? And this could also help replicate some of the simulated effects from a paper that I presented at CogSci last year. So with that, I'd really like to thank all of my collaborators as well as my PI Tao Gao. And I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have.
Hi, this was a super cool methodology, super clever. This might be obvious, but this isn't my field, so forgive me. What was the motivation for not telling them whether they got the shape right?
Yeah, so I think we didn't want to bias them towards one strategy or the other, right? So if we told you all the time that the like when you had two identical items and the item closer to you or the individually efficient item was always right, then we would be sort of teaching you to choose individual utility as your strategy. So in this case, we wanted to leave it up to people to see what are they doing.
If there's not another question, then I have another one. Oh, okay. I was just wondering whether there were and whether it would be different if there were trials where there wasn't any ambiguity, where like they just said square and there's only one square and you just go to the square kind of thing.
So in this particular experiment, there were no trials that didn't have ambiguity. However, I think in sort of like a preliminary experiment that we ran a while ago before this, we did have some trials that didn't have ambiguity in them, and people seem to be very good at solving this.
Yeah, thank you. And it didn't change their answers to other ones. Okay. Cool, thank you.
Mhm.
Sorry, I can't hear the speaker, but can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I hear you, but I couldn't hear the voice from the audience. Thank you very much for showing such exciting data. And so you demonstrated that not all of the participants engaged in pragmatic reasoning, while at the same time, the same people reasoned about actions the way we would expect rational agents to act. And I also worked with the rational speech-acting models. I really would like to believe that signaling games do represent pragmatic reasoning, but the results that you showed made me doubt this, especially the results with how much time it took people to make the decision. So when you demonstrated the distribution of the reaction times, that the pragmatic decisions actually are very slow. And I thought, this seems very counterintuitive because linguistic decisions should be fast. The speech happens at such a high rate that if we take very long to make those decisions, maybe it is a signal that in those limited game scenarios, we are not tapping into the linguistic capacity altogether, but asking people to do logical puzzles. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of the motivation of this work came from, so I come from more like a social cognition modeling side of this. So I think a lot of the motivation of this work came from the idea that we can start with these really rich interactions and models that we have of cooperation and build very, very sparse signaling and communication on top of that to help do even more complex things together. So that's the perspective that I was sort of thinking in that sense, but I do agree that there could be some kinds of effects coming from just having to figure everything out in this spatial environment, and that make it a little bit less easy in terms of natural conversation. So no, I mean, I think it's a good point that you raise, and that maybe some of the follow-up work that we can do can try and tease that apart a little bit better.
Thank you.
Yeah.